Welcome to episode 184 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about the 1968 album on Impulse by Elvin Jones and Richard Davis, Heavy Sounds. And for all you youngsters out there, as you look at my 1976 Japanese reissue, know that smoking is bad for you. And inside the classic Impulse gatefold with pictures of everybody, everybody who's on the gig, including Billy Green, this guy, who for whom this is his only known recording. Anyhow, Heavy Sounds is a bit of a hodgepodge. It's got four pieces of hard bop, some of which are kind of blues tinged. One song, which is Elvin Jones for the first half of it, playing blues guitar, and then followed up with a more conventional four-piece treatment. And then one absolutely jaw-dropping, avant-garde, spiritual, call it what you want, masterpiece, which alone is reason enough to pick up this record, absent everything else. I gave some history on Richard Davis the other day when I was reviewing one of his records, so this time I'll concentrate on Elvin Jones, who was born in Pontiac, Michigan in 1927. His parents were from Mississippi, and they'd been part of the Great Migration, which saw so many black people come north. He is in a family of 5 siblings, all are musical. His brother Hank was a pianist, and Thad, who's a trumpeter, also went on to have successful jazz careers. Elvin has an interest in the drums from a very early age. He's one of these kids who's just basically tapping on everything. He plays drums in his segregated high school's marching band, and then after high school, he goes and joins the Army. When he gets out of the Army in 1949, he returns to Pontiac, Michigan, which of course is very close to Detroit, and he plays in Detroit clubs, first of all, with his brothers Sam and Thad. Because of his burgeoning talent, which became quite well known around the Detroit club scene, he soon began to play with other players, and there was a real scene in Detroit at the time, people like Kenny Burrell, Paul Chambers, and Tommy Flanagan. There was a well-known jazz club in Detroit at the time called the Bluebird, and the guy who had the house band there was a guy called Billy Mitchell. He brings in Jones as his drummer, and in that capacity, not only was he playing gigs with these Detroit musicians, but Elvin also got a chance to play with all the other musicians that came through and had the backing band play with them. And those included people like Miles Davis and John Coltrane, with whom, of course, Elvin would later form the classic Coltrane Quartet. In 1955, Elvin leaves for New York to try out initially for Benny Goodman's band. He doesn't get the gig, but 2 weeks later, consolation prize, which actually better than the original prize, he ends up playing with Mingus, and he plays with Mingus for about a year, and they have a fabulous musical relationship. He then plays with Bud Powell for about a year. Subsequently, he then tours Europe with J.J. Johnson, and he records with a whole bunch of people in between in the late 1950s, including people like Stan Getz and Sonny Rollins, as well as his old contacts from Detroit, people like Tommy Flanagan and Paul Chambers. His real step up to the big time, of course, occurred in 1960 when he was asked to join John Coltrane's quartet. Jones, of course, was a remarkable drummer even before he joined Coltrane, but the Coltrane group gave him the opportunity to improvise, not simply in the form of set drum solos, although of course there were those, but more in developing his own polyrhythmic drumming style, his fills and flourishes, often copied actually, including by rock drummers, people like Mitch Mitchell and Ginger Baker, adding so much to the overall texture and feel and back and forth and almost communal feel of those Coltrane records. All good things must come to an end, however, and in 1966, Coltrane adds Rashid Ali, wanted to go in a different direction. It wasn't a direction that Jones wanted to go. It wasn't really a direction that McCoy Tyner had wanted to go either. Anyway, the classic quartet falls apart. Jones goes to Europe with Duke Ellington for a while, then he comes back to the States, and from 1967 on, he begins to record more as a leader. As for Richard Davis, I reviewed his album The Philosophy of the Spiritual the other day, so I won't repeat too much of what I said there. Suffice it to say that this guy is perhaps the great virtuoso bass player of the 60s and 70s in jazz. He's played extensively in a classical symphonic context. He's played with Bernstein, he played with Stravinsky, but he's also played pop and rock and has contributed to albums by Van Morrison and Bruce Springsteen. However, his jazz recordings, particularly ones where he's pushed by being with other players who are quite innovative and maybe even avant-garde, are spectacular. This record is recorded June 19th and 20th, 1967 at RCA Studios in Manhattan, which is a little bit unusual because almost every Impulse record, certainly the ones produced by Bob Thiel around this time, were being recorded at Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. What's happened is that Thiel is already booked into RCA Studios to make a record with Larry Coryell, who is sick, doesn't show. Now, Jones and Davis had come in as session guys on that record, and so they're all there, and the leader isn't there. So Theo says, well, why don't you guys play something anyway? I'll just get the tape rolling. So what happens is Davis takes out his bow and he starts to play Summertime, just kind of as a warm-up. And there's an impromptu duet. There's no discussion. There's no editing of the tape. There's no plan. They just set about playing. First Davis and then Jones comes in. It's so good. Theo recognizes this. They all recognize this, that they can't just not release this, but it's too long for a single. It's over 11 minutes long. So Jones says, well, hang on, I'll get my other band guys in. I'll get Frank Foster, who was a saxophonist for many, many years with Count Basie, and Billy Green, who was his pianist at the time. They can come in the next day and we'll fill out the rest of the record. So that's what happens. On the 20th, these other two guys come in and they cut 5 other tracks. I mentioned this album was a bit of a potpourri because, of course, it was based on this extemporized duet, and the very next day they had to fill out the rest of the album. So the song selection is pretty much kind of what people had handy, and that includes a couple of tracks by Frank Foster. The first of these is Rancherita, which is a blues. It's a 14-bar blues, actually. Kind of, if you're used to tapping toe along to a 12-bar blues, it's a little bit unsettling, but eventually you get used to it. Foster's playing here, I think, is the best on the whole record. Here, it's quite ahead of its time. It wouldn't actually have been out of place in some of those CTI jazz funk releases in the 1970s. Billy then takes a solo, and then Richard Davis asserts himself for the first time. Starts out fairly conventionally, and then gets wilder and wilder with these notes just sliding up and down the neck. The next song is the second of the two Foster tunes, and this is Shiny Stockings, which is a standard which Foster had written when he was in the Basie Orchestra, which had become quite a well-known track in the Basie songbook. This is really satisfying to listen to, quite loud actually, for a couple of reasons. Elvin's amazing fills, but also because Davis is quite high in the mix. In fact, the rhythm section in general, the way that's captured all the way through this record, is so satisfying to the ears. The last track on side 1 is M.E., which is a little bit of a throwaway. It's the only Billy Green composition. In fact, one of only 2 compositions which Billy Green had recorded. It's basically a straightforward hard bop number, nothing particularly memorable. But then we flip the record, and side 2, first track, is where we get to the main event, which is, of course, this duet, Summertime. There's a few taps from Elvin, and then Richard comes in, first of all with the bow, stating the melody, and then he moves high up the neck, conjuring cello or even violin-like sounds from his bass. He then switches to pizzicato at the same time as Elvin switches to brushes. I mentioned the engineering, which is fantastic. Every plucked note, every rim shot is standing out in glorious isolation. After a while, Elvin takes over. The soundstage is just magnificent for that particular piece, and you can hear practically everything. Him breathing, you can hear these little grunts of satisfaction as he's playing. And then Richard comes in finally, almost screeching, kind of like Coltrane or Sanders, but obviously on a different instrument. Then you get one final note on the bass, and that's it. And I have to say that including Albert Ayler's remarkable earlier version of this song in '64 on his second record, this is probably, I think, the best instrumental rendition of this song, certainly that I've ever heard. Then we have the little guitar oddity I mentioned, Elvin's Guitar Blues, where Elvin Jones takes his bow on a recording playing blues guitar, and he's pretty darn good. Bearing in mind, of course, his family's musical tradition, very musical family, was from the Mississippi Delta, so he comes by it honestly, and it's a very passable blues. He lays down 32 bars worth. Frank Foster comes in and solos for another 32 bars, and that's it. The final track is Here's That Rainy Day, which, like a lot of jazz standards, is a song from a musical, Carnival in Flanders, which sounds fun until you think about what Flanders is like. And then, anyway, Foster leads off, stating the melody in kind of a stately way, and then all of a sudden he's off in these rapid-fire runs. I'm not necessarily that wild about his tone. It may have been the way that it was captured, but to me, it's one of the things about this record that I don't totally enjoy. But there's never any doubt when you hear Foster play that he's the master of his instrument. This is a record which was 4 parts pretty good, 1 part interesting, and 1 absolutely gobsmackingly, jaw-droppingly good. Quite seriously, for audiophiles watching this, that 1 track is going to be real catharsis. It's going to feel like vindication for all the money you wasted on that cartridge. On the record, it's surrounded by some pretty good tunes, including that rare turn by Jones on guitar. My only complaints on this record are basically 2. First is that Foster and Green, although both very good players, are not really in the same, I won't say caliber or league, I'll say not in the same zone in terms of being adventurous as musicians as Jones and Davis clearly are. The second complaint I have, again, which is minor and it's understandable given the circumstances under which the record came together, is that the song choices are a little bit unimaginative. So this could have been so much more as it was thrown together at the last minute, but what can you do? For me, it's 4 out of 5 with 1 all-world moment.